Welcome to Turning the Page. I'm host Donnie Morse of Confetti Antiques and Books. And today we're pleased to have Joy Bischoff with us, who has written a new book on the Old World and the New World Mayan calendar, this 2012 prophecy that we hear so much about, and kind of how those two Old World, New World fit together. Joy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Donnie.
Before we get to your book, let's talk a little bit about you and where you're from and kind of why you got into writing.
Why I got into writing? Well, I wasn't a natural writer. I used to be an actress and a singer and a performer. But I began becoming more and more interested in the writings of Hugh Nibley. And I had a lot of people who used to ask me about Hugh Nibley. They would say, explain this to me, I don't get it. And I've done research, religious research all my life. And so I began to study his works more and more to try to explain them to people. Because Hugh Nibley actually, Donnie, made a really big mistake. His biggest mistake.
What's that?
He thought we were smarter than we are.
Oh.
And so I've had to study his books over and over and continue my own research to untangle all of those knots and find out the pattern that he really did discover in all of the Old World manuscripts that he has translated and put together these pieces to make sense out of all these things.
So Hugh Nibley played an important part in your development as a writer or as in a subject material?
Well, actually, Hugh Nibley interested me when I was a child. I first started reading some of his books when I was little. I have a non-Mormon father who is very anti-Mormon, in fact, and he didn't let us go to the LDS church until we were 18 or have anything to do with Mormons. So I was raised going to other religions, which was very helpful to me, and I love comparative religion, and that's been a hobby of mine all of my life. But I learned many wonderful things in those churches too, and had a lot of respect for them, and had a good Bible education from there. But sometimes my father would leave all of these anti-Mormon books in my drawers or by my bedside, and so when I read Nibley's No Ma'am, That's Not History book, it helped me with my own research to be able to explain the things that I believed in.
Now that particular booklet addresses Fawn Brody?
Yes, the No Man Knows My History book, which my father gave me to read, and I read that, and then I read Nibley's book.
That was a biography that she did on the prophet Joseph Smith.
Right, on the prophet Joseph Smith, and also Hugh Nibley met with my mother once for a couple of hours and helped her with some of the questions that she had to speak to my father. And then he used to, about once every month or two, send a letter to my mom with his latest archaeology findings and understandings to help strengthen her, and I used to read those, and those things meant a lot to me.
A lot of people, especially even people who are educated, when they read Hugh Nibley's works, it just goes, I mean, his writing is not easy to understand, and so you, who had a good understanding of that, folks would come visit you, and they would ask for your help in understanding Hugh Nibley? Right,
they would. I would sit down and I would discuss it, and I would also teach it in my institute class that I would teach. I would share some of those things and break them down and help people to understand and encourage them to read Brother Nibley's books, because they're very, very important. And I encourage people not to just listen to me or not just to read my book, but to, after doing so, then go back and read his books, because they are filled with things that I think are more important than most people realize. At the end of my mission, I had an experience that convinced me to take some years and just focus on the scriptures. So I actually left other books alone for quite a few years after my mission, and I just studied and studied in the scriptures. The more I studied the Old Testament, the more I grew to love it, and finally began to see that a pattern began to unfold to me with the stories and the symbolism of the Old Testament. So then, finally, when I began picking up Brother Nibley's books and reading them, I discovered that he knew that same pattern, except he did it a lot better than I did. And I really began deeply studying his works. And then when I returned to college, when my husband was getting his law degree, I returned, and I was going to BYU, slowly raising our kids. And I cheated as far as understanding Nibley. I have a degree in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from BYU, and whenever I had to do a paper, you do a lot in that major, I would go to the religious section of the library, and I would skim through or read dozens of books for every every paper that I had to write. And I would say a good 70 or 80% of the books in the religious section, little scribbling notes all over the margins by Nibley. Someone, a librarian there told me, yes, Hugh Nibley reads these things when they come in and he just scribbles all over them, his thoughts. So I was picking his brain for years at BYU Library as I was reading all of these ancient translations of these manuscripts and seeing what Brother Nibley actually thought about all of these stories. That helped me further my understanding of this religious pattern that has fascinated me, and that I then discovered, much to my shock, I had no idea that I would come to this point. I then discovered that the Mayans knew the same pattern, and that 2012 was all about this pattern.
Well, let's bring up your book here then. This is the book that you've written, and it's titled 2012 Nibley's Ancient New Year Rite. One, it's not easy to say, and two, it doesn't easily explain itself.
No, it doesn't.
Explain to the audience exactly what it is you were hoping to convey with your book.
All right. Nibley said that the Ancient New Year Rite was the focus of all of his studies. It was the thing that he studied the most in his adult life and tried to explain and expound upon. Because within the New Year Rite that almost every ancient civilization that I have studied, which are a lot of them, they all had this as their major celebration. It was their major holiday.
So like New Year's, is that what?
New Year's was it. Some of them had New Year's at a different time of the year, but the concepts and the principles
I mean, it wasn't just
were the same.
Getting drunk and putting on a party hat. And
No, in fact, the whole New Year's Eve bit, very important concept that they can find in the book, and they can find out why it's a good idea to have a designated driver through the turning of the year to help us get safely through without too much chaos. And that's one of the things that this book is about.
I see.
Yes, but the New Year Rite, they all have these same principles, these concepts that they did, that Nibley says takes us back to the beginning of creation.
Oh, I see.
So they have the king installed. They have the battle between good and evil. Then they have the king organizing his kingdom around him. And in fact, the understanding of the New Year Rite really opens up our understanding of Egyptology, the establishment of the king and their rights, and the boat trip up the Nile, and him ordering his kingdom around him, and why they built the pyramids. We talk about that in here. Why they built the pyramids. People have been debating that for centuries, and they talk about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people involved in the building of those elaborate places, the expense involved, the time. Why would they do that? Just as a burial place for a pharaoh, and usually they weren't used as burial places. The pharaoh wasn't even buried there, so why?
Let's go to commercial break, and when we get back, we'll talk more about 2012 and why it is so special. This is Turning the Page, and I'm host Donnie Morse. We'll be right back.